Well, first, thank you for inviting me and thank you for this kind introduction. I hope you do not mind if I read my paper, just to make sure I do not exceed the time that is allocated to me. And I'd like to start with connecting life stories and the recent complexities of the past. In making sense of a complex and traumatic recent past and presenting untold stories in this context, a turn to biographical approach has often been a critical solution. For many contested topics, most notably past atrocities, revolts, history of migration, history of working class, the use of retrospective life narratives has sometimes been the only way to recognize, understand, and acknowledge the untold stories of the recent past. Bringing autobiographies into the exhibition space has been seen as a measure to democratize history, to give voice to groups marginalized or underrepresented in historiography, to present contradictory experiences, and ultimately to challenge the dominant narrative of the past. Given the long history of museums, biographies have not been on display for very long. Still, they have been part of museum collecting practices. In the spirit of new museology, where the value of the object lies in the story surrounding it, autobiographical accounts have been an indispensable research tool. The role of biographies in informing and supporting the musealization of objects, while at the same time making them secondary to the objects themselves, is thus a phenomenon with a much longer history. With the rise of oral history as a research method in the 1970s to make visible the so-called history from below, the preconditions were also created for the entry of biographical narratives into the museum space. For example, in the 1980s, community-based oral historians in Britain, which is a pioneer country in oral history research, often presented their findings in exhibitions. Exhibitions offered and it's peculiar, a relatively cheap and easily accessible means of communication. And usually these exhibitions combine photographs and extracts from interviews. In the 90s, exhibitions increasingly began to include audio and video transcripts of recorded interviews. The innovative use of technology in museums and galleries has made individual biographies increasingly accessible to visitors. And many museums have also begun to work more closely with their audiences through oral history projects based on shared authority. Just to make sure. Oral history researchers and collectors have seen the value of biographies for museums in terms of how they have understood their own activities and purposes. Paul Thompson, for example, in his classic text, The Voice of the Past, which was first published in 1978, saw the virtue of oral history as an extension of the understanding of history to underrepresented groups, the possibility of secondary experiencing the past across generations, and the accompanying changes in education. Above all, however, the ethical imperative of oral history to give back the voice to those marginalized by history has been stressed. Andrea Hayek, almost 40 years later, argues in favor of oral history in the museum space that is, offers a multitude of perspectives and interpretations, thus challenging dominant narratives about the past events and demonstrating how complex history can be. The latter assertion and belief, if one may say so, has recently been critically examined by museum scholars, oral historians, and memory researchers alike, asking to what extent this capacity attributed to memories and life stories is realized in the museum space and what its limits are. In this presentation, I take the position of a memory researcher. And I will take a short and, I'm afraid, also fragmented tour around the Baltic history museums to give an insight into the mnemonic affordances that museums create for their visitors through biographical approaches in exhibitions. That is, by presenting life stories and oral histories, and by sketching the life histories of historical subjects. The materials I present in my talk have been collected within the framework of the research project, Practices and Challenges of Mnemonic Pluralism in Baltic History Museums, in which we comparatively study 20th century exhibition and collection practices in different types of museums in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Baltic museums' belated turn towards new museology occurred after the post-communist transition in the 2000s, coinciding with a biographical boom and with memory wars over the meaning of the 20th century. As a result of these entangled processes, biographical methodology's potential to enhance empathetic and critical dialogue with the past and eventually facilitate the redemocratizing of memory culture has been recognized and applied in the museums. But as you see, the project started only a year ago, so I can present preliminary thoughts and observations with a few examples, which I hope will inspire some discussion and feedback. But first, let's start with some concepts which have been used to make sense of the recent past, especially concerning untold stories, which often inform the purposes life stories should fulfill in an exhibition. These are the concepts of dark heritage and difficult past. Of course, it has been also used as dark past and difficult heritage and so on. These different qualities of the recent past are related to the different uses of stories in the museum space. Dark heritage denotes cultural heritage as potentially dark force, related to times of conflict, death, and suffering. These aspects may have different meanings for different groups and communities, depending, for instance, upon the role in the conflict, the temporal distance from the event, and hierarchies of power. As Susie Thomas and others have noted, dark heritage always has an element of physical conflict, destruction, and other atrocities, which may include but also go beyond other less physically violent or specific event-related controversies. Therefore, dark heritage is always contested and difficult. The typical form of autobiographical recollection represented in the context of dark heritage is a testimony, a witness story, and the dominant subject position is that of a victim. But Thomas proceeds, difficult and contested heritage is not always necessarily dark. Difficult past is a metaphor used to describe the past that has left unresolved issues that haunt the present day and keep being contested by different actors. In the Baltic region, the unresolved issues of the recent past are still related to the Second World War and the Soviet period, or to the new inequalities created by the post-Soviet memory regime, in terms of who is represented in public history or how to be represented in public history. Post-communist memory work in the Baltics and more broadly in Eastern and Central Europe has primarily taken place within the framework of two opposing interpretation paradigms, the conflict between which is one of the main reasons why, for example, the Soviet period in general is still a difficult and contested past. The totalitarian paradigm builds on Cold War perceptions and focuses on violent repression and human rights violations. In terms of memory culture, it is a black and white model in which local peoples were presented as objects of subjugation by totalitarian forces. Within this paradigm, the dominant subject positions are victims and resistance fighter. The dominant form of autobiographical narrative is also a testimony. Thus, the totalitarian paradigm in extreme cases, allows the whole of the Soviet past to be interpreted as a dark past and to use the correspondent repertoire. As an opposition, the everyday life paradigm refutes the idea of monolithical, almighty totalitarian state based on the omnipotence of party state agents and the dependence of the local on central agencies. This paradigm promoted the perspective of ordinary people living their lives outside of the party state power. This is also called a normalization paradigm due to its focus on the normalcy of the everyday. Biographical methods and life storytelling have been influential in this respect in research and memory work. There is no particular preference for using an autobiographical genre or focusing on historical subject positions, except that they are not exclusively identifiable as victims and resistance fighters. I will now take a closer look at some examples of how museums have used biographies in their 20th century exhibitions. I will focus on the function of biographies in these exhibitions and the question of what kind of remembering a particular use of life stories enables. The background is still the Andrea Hayek's highlighted promise of oral history to offer a multitude of perspectives and interpretations, thus challenging dominant, often national narratives about past events and demonstrating how complex history can be. The presentation of biographies is, we will start with dark history mode. The presentation of biographies in dark history mode is primarily the domain of the Memorial Museum's atrocities, among which Holocaust museums in particular have led the way in terms of distinctive aesthetic repertoire and the way of mediating memories. As Steffi de Jong has shown, memorial museums are designed to provide visitors with insights into specific historical events, while at the same time instructing them how to interpret these events. Through the selection of video excerpts, the placement of these excerpts, and the choice of final sentences, the curator conveys certain historical narratives and certain interpretation of the past to the detriment of others. In the post-communist space, the function of the Memorial Museum of Mass Violence has been partly taken over by specially created museums of communism, whose equivalent in Baltic countries are the so-called occupation museums. The Museum of Occupation of Latvia has recently opened a permanent exhibition using the dark history mode to tell the story of mass repression against the titular nation. The museum can draw on extensive research and professional oral history archive. In a previous exhibition, they were intercut with video footage of the deportation of 1941 and 49, reconstructing, in the words of the survivors, the course events and their experiences, and highlighting the experiences of fear and helplessness, loss of loved ones, cold and hunger, and in this way, a chronological narrative of deportation, of leaving home, of the arduous journey, and of settling in inhuman conditions emerges, which both informs and mediates specific experiences in such a way as to create a coherent collective narrative of repression. The new permanent exhibition, which is on the screen, follows the same principle, but displays many individual faces and a succession of windows, so windows as faces, to transmit the message. In this way, the performance takes on the format of a Holocaust Memorial Museum, where the witnesses speak individually, but they are also felt as a mass, with an essential affective dimension beyond the inbuilt environment and the choice of colors. The repertoire of the dark history mode can be used different ways and for various purposes. For example, in Vabamu, Estonia, which uses a biographical approach in the legends of the objects, universalizes the experience of violence during and after the Second World War as an experience of infinite evil, and connects the trajectories of the suffering of different ethnic groups multidirectionally. So, and therefore approaches a cosmopolitan mode of remembering. In the Latvian Occupation Museum, the dark history mode is incorporated into the paradigm of totalitarianism, which tells a story of the Latvian people at the mercy of totalitarian forces. The audiovisual stories are pervasively integrated into a linear narrative in the exhibition, with excerpts selected to support it. So even if the oral histories that forms the basis of the exhibition's audiovisual exhibits could offer different perspectives and interpretations, and as Andrea Hayek has argued, in the case of Latvian Occupation Museum, they are domesticated and homogenized to support the museum's perspective. However, I want to give an example of how the domestication of diversity can also be a way of critically assessing and addressing memory myth. As a multi-museum collaborative project, the National History Museum of Latvia had an exhibition, Latvia's Century, open from 2018 to 20. The exhibition makes very little use of recorded audiovisual stories, but it does apply a biographical perspective to almost every theme. Individuals' life histories are presented with their material belongings as examples of different realizations of what it means to be Latvian or live in Latvia in a particular historical period. Thus, potentially challenging stories are placed within the exhibition's overarching motive of a shared experience in Latvia. In a sense, we can speak here of the domestication of difference, and this remains the case for many of the themes in this exhibition. But there are several layers to the exhibition narrative, including a layer of remembering, or how a period and the practices of Latvianness, characteristic of that period, have left their mark on cultural and social memory. The slide shows an image of a life history stand on the themed room Latvia, Karlis Ulmanis authoritarian regime, which deconstructs the creation of power and nation building between 1934 and 40. The stand brings together the life histories of people from ethnically and socially diverse backgrounds who lived during this period. It presents them through the positive contributions these people made to Latvia's social economy and culture. It is a part of deconstruction method aimed at critically evaluating the collective memory of the golden age of Ulmanis, which in turn has fed the totalitarian approach to the Soviet past during the Cold War and during the post-communist turn. So this was about the one interpretive scheme to approach the complexities of the recent past and this, the totalitarian paradigm. Let me now turn to the paradigm of everyday life, in which the study of oral history, life stories, and history from below have played a significant role. Everyday life paradigm has impacted the memory studies as well, resulting in approaches to generational memories, rural-urban divide, gender and educational differences, and addressing the issue of nostalgia for the former communist rule. As an example of how the everyday life paradigm has informed the use of biographies is an exhibition, Parallel Words and Parallel Lives, which is a part of the permanent exhibition at the Estonian National Museum. It presents Cold War era experiences from both sides of the Iron Curtain and brings together under one concept groups such as local Estonians and Soviet era immigrants, stereotyped by the totalitarian paradigm as opposing and conflicting. The experience of different groups is first temporalized by decades, thus avoiding an ideological labeling of periods that is sometimes inherent in the totalitarian paradigm. Through the stories and objects accompanying them, historical macro time, which curators call great history or big history, social time, or time of the ethnic group, the work collective, the family, or the so-called cohort of destiny, and personal time enter into dialogue. An additional temporalizing level is added by linking different stories using keywords, such as trauma, duty, love, friendship, achievement, or joy. The result is a polyphony that presents a Cold War experience from a humanistic perspective, and even in fact steps outside the paradigm of everyday life as an interpretive approach opposite to that of the totalitarianism. So the opposition is not in play anymore. So what I would call humanistic approach is supported by the reconceptualization of museum space as being more polyphonic and open-ended. In the case of the biographical exhibition of the Estonian National Museum, the main argument of the critics of the paradigm of everyday life is that it does not take into account the repressive side of the Soviet regime, which was often hidden from the common people, does not hold. However, here multi-perspectivity is downplayed by the fact that the structural circumstances that shape people's lives remain hidden from the visitor. The contrasting experience of the Soviet regime are sometimes presented through the prism of innocent childhoods, and the potential of multi-perspectivity that exists is hindered by over-aestheticized design. However, if we return for a moment to the promises of Thompson and Hayek, this biographical exhibition certainly adds color and passion to the big history and creates multivocality. It stresses a humanistic perspective instead of political and creates strict descriptions of historical processes and experiences of the 20th century since 40s. Finally, we may ask, is there any chance that the opposition between the totalitarian paradigm and the everyday life paradigm can be resolved through a biographical perspective to manifest the potential of biographies to facilitate multi-perspectivity on the past, especially when the past is the focus of contested perspectives and the potential source of contemporary tensions. As a final example, I would like to talk about the exhibition titled Project Homo Sovieticus, which opened last year in the mansion of the Tuskulėnai Memorial Park, Vilnius, Lithuania. The exhibition's concept, despite the title and the contradictory design, is to highlight the multifaceted nature of the Soviet era and its internal paradoxes and contradictions. This was a quote from the exhibition's introduction. With a reservation that, and this is also quote, everything is intertwined in life. The exhibition is presented on 3 levels and also physically. So the upper level was publicly visible, officially announced and propagandistic. Then comes people's everyday life and what was considered normal. And finally, the so-called deviations from Soviet normality, from crime to the fight and resistance to the system. The curators have left room for interpretation to the visitor, pointing out that the positioning of some exhibits at some exhibition level is likely to raise doubt or trigger thoughts that it should be moved elsewhere. According to the museum, a fundamental feature of the exhibition is being as non-definitive as the assessment of the Soviet era or the effort to understand it. A separate part of the exhibition, the beginning or the end, depending on how you enter it, is the Alley of Memories, which is the exhibits of which are on the slide. And this alley of memories has excellent potential to bring out these contradictions and complexities at the level of the individuals, letting the stories themselves speak first and foremost, and thus giving the visitor this declared freedom of interpretation. So how does the potential of multi-perspectivity, or even radical multi-perspectivity, so bringing forth the conflict and conflictual standpoints and life courses in history, manifest itself through the subject positions presented. Conflicting characters are presented here: a deportee, an anti-communist partisan and dissident, but also a high party functionary and NKVD spy and a traitor of the partisans. Each is given some characters are presented as typological figures of the era: a collective farm leader, construction worker, store manager, collective farm worker, and KGB agent. Each is given a first-person narrative telling the story of a particular individual or an imaginary person. There is a strong contrast between the life perspectives and attitudes of these actual and imaginary actors. However, in my view, the multi-perspectivity does not realize in full because the curators have used narrative and effective devices that produce sometimes opposite effect. From the perspective of dominant memory regime, the victims and resistant fighters speak in a quiet, soft and calm voice with a commitment to their cause and of their suffering, and thus carrying a message of martyrdom. The high party functionary, the traitor and the kolkhoz chairman, on the other hand, speak loudly, intrusively and self-effacingly of their achievements, their position of power and their commitment to the cause of the Communist Party, ridiculing and scorning their counterparts, which I may say these stories are also fictional. And these stories are utterly blind to the paradoxes and the internal contradictions that their position offered, and which was supposed to be the central idea of the exhibition. The use of informal networks, theft at the workplace, and more broadly the practices of blood, take on the meaning of conscious disregard for morality through the mouth of the department store manager. And at the same time, the kolkhoz worker is presented in a powerless subaltern position in which theft in the workplace is an essential strategy of survival with no choice. The result is that those subject positions that deviate from the suffering and the resistant narrative come to represent the collective other in terms of dominant memory culture. Through the way the museum has designed the stories and even the voices that tell the stories. So to conclude, which will be much shorter. So the assumption that the inclusion of life stories in a museum exhibition offers multiple perspectives and interpretations, thus challenging dominant, often national narratives about past events and showing how complex history can be, as Andrea Hayek enthusiastically argued, is not the end of the story. Life narratives do not necessarily constitute an open communication. While the autobiographical and biographical genres allow for the introduction of multiple perspectives that can challenge each other and the dominant memory culture, they can also achieve the exact opposite. The cases I've presented show that in their attempt to represent the 20th century difficult past, museums turn to biographies to find their way through a web of contradictory interpretive schemes. The result, however, I think, is a diversification of the mnemonic affordances museum create, and in a broader sense, a democratization of memory culture. I have excluded from this presentation cases for introducing biographical perspectives in the exhibition space allows the otherwise linear narrative to be confused and interrupted And these cases are maybe even more than you saw on the slide here. But you see, it's another story. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. So what do you think, where this difference comes between Latvia and Estonia, the way these main huge expositions are made in Museum of Occupation, Freedom, however they are called. So how would you explain, did you interview curators, so how was your research done? Yeah.
Well, if we take this one type of museums, the Occupation Museum in Latvia, formerly named Occupation Museum in Estonia, then well, I can't say about the definite reason of why to choose this kind of autobiographical genre. But the overall difference, I think, comes from how the museum conceptualizes itself and the space that it offers to the visitors. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay. Well, the Estonian Occupation Museum, may I say Vabamu because it's shorter, has undergone really radical reconceptualization from being a kind of memorial museum and an active agent in recognition politics to being a kind of a civic center, education center. So it addresses the contemporary actual problems, and maybe collaborates with more younger and liberal groups. So in the Latvian Occupation Museum, as far as I understood, because the curator interviews are still not thoroughly analyzed, we made them only this August. But there, I think they are both private museums. So they are run by emigre foundations. And maybe the interest of the Latvian foundation has been much different, and the freedom the owner leaves for curators is also much smaller. So it has been, as far as we understood, some discussion. I don't know how heavy they were about how to approach this history of the 20th century. And then I think this rather conservative narrative has been decided by the foundation, or the key actors in the foundation. Yes, I think this is the main reason. There are, of course, other factors which I cannot maybe number here in specific. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. I would like to ask you, what do you think about where is the borderline between the open archives and the museum? Because sometimes in the oral history narrative, the museums are really close to the open archive and sometimes change the how can we collect items to the oral histories archive, because the items sometimes speak more as just the interviews for us in the museum.
I'm not quite sure I understood the question. You mean the open archive as oral history archive?
Yeah, because sometimes the oral histories came to the like a partner archive, and the museum sometimes is more as an open oral history collection. So what do you think, what is the borderline between, because sometimes many archives collect oral history also, and open it and present it sometimes in exhibitions. But the museum sometimes, I think, it's much more as a collection of oral histories.
Oh yes, I absolutely agree that that there is a vast difference, and well, I think what the main functions of a particular institution is, and what defines museum, and what defines an archive, is the main borderline between the two phenomena. Yes, when the functions of the museum are so multifaceted, like collecting, research, mediating, communicating, also doing community work, perhaps, and the archives very often do not fulfill all this range of, yeah. It's a the objects are objects, in my view, in this comparison, are only a matter of preference.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
If there's no other...
At the moment there wasn't, yeah, please.
So now we are all very, very involved and following the war in Ukraine situation. As a reaction, at least in Latvian society, probably in Estonian too, there's also very heavy censorship about for someone not to understand in museum expositions or someone else or displays that somehow there's some vaguely positive attitude towards Soviet heritage. Or, you know, you have to kind of explain things that, you know, it was, you know, we denied that it was horrible. So how do you see how the museum, I don't know, main expositions will be changed maybe? Or do you see any influence of this war happening now? People also in museums becoming more, I think, radicalized, non-tolerant. I'm looking at this Vilnius exposition and I'm wondering if that would be possible now, when, you know, during the war. These plural, multi-narrative, you know, where you actually hear people you don't agree with, definitely.
Well, a correction about the Vilnius exhibition. My argument was that this multi-plural image is not so multi-plural as it sounds, because the curator, using affective methods and narrative methods, still somehow manages to kind of mold it into this, into the rather conservative narrative of the Soviet past. So it's not so multi-plural as it looks on the screen. Well, it's a question how the museum, how it would reflect, the war would reflect on permanent exhibitions. I don't think it reflects on any way right now, except for accompanying programs for I think, but I haven't followed this question, but I think it's good to ask it, because, you know, all these museum professionals gathered here. It's an excellent opportunity to maybe to take this question to the final discussion, if you allow. Yeah.
I have a secret kind of information I don't want to give out of the museums and shame anyone, but I heard that there's an exhibition made about the workers. Like people who work in certain industry. Mm-hmm. And there's this self-censorship. Oh my God, if we write anything that kind of reflects too lightly on this Soviet heritage where these workers at the time and the industry they worked in, we have to literally spell out, you know, for the visitors. Otherwise they won't be able to understand that those are bad times. So I'm just, my question was like more about like how you simplify the narrative, how you kind of buy more into, you feel the museums also should be involved in kind of propaganda, even the one we agree with and we love it, you know. So that was my question.
Yes, I think this the same question is always in the background also in these exhibitions. Then, well, I have a visitor perspective, of course. When I look at these exhibitions, and when I feel the potential of, for example, in Estonian National Museum, the parallel lives, parallel worlds. I feel that there should be perhaps more written narrative to, you know, point out what the benefits of this exhibition are. But then in other exhibitions, you simultaneously feel that would you please skip some of this narrative? So you see, there is always this. It's always an ambivalent question, I think. Yeah. And another visitor, maybe you, take another perspective. Yeah.
I actually have a small question. You ended maybe in some pessimistic way, a little bit, that this multi-perspectivity is actually, it is from one side it is a goal, but it is not possible to achieve, or did I read you not correct?
No, I wanted to actually be rational in my in my ending or in my conclusion in terms of not being overly enthusiastic about when we put a life story on the exhibitions and it solves all the problems, which has been when I read all these enthusiastic definitions of life stories and oral histories in the museum space. Well, I think I don't think the solution can be 100% that you know, you redefine your goal and rethink what you want to achieve when you use autobiographical materials. But still, I think this multi-perspectivity has not been such a goal so far in 20th century exhibitions. You know, because there is a long way from this cultural trauma discourse when the museums, along with the society, have undergone this really painful process of social becoming, of understanding what we actually feel about the 20th century, and understanding what the spectrum in the society is in respect of this understanding of the 20th century. And maybe coming back to the previous question, the war in Ukraine will prevent or extend this process even more to become more maybe critical about the possibilities of oral histories and autobiographical material in the exhibition, and maybe being more conscious about what you want to achieve. Yeah.
Thank you. If there is no more questions, then thank you once more. Ene.
Yeah, thanks.